Well, hello and welcome to Perfection Learning's professional development for projects and professional communication. We'd like to thank you for adopting projects and professional communication, and I think you're going to be very happy with the resource that you've got. My name is Zach Smith. I am actually the North Texas and Panhandle sales rep for Perfection Learning, but the reason it's me speaking with you and not someone from the home office is I used to teach professional communication in Irving ISD not that many years ago. So I have very vivid memories of what it's like to be a prof com teacher. What's neat about professional communication, I feel like, is that it's a very flexible class, and you've got a lot of options as to how to teach the class. If you have more of a business background, a CTE background, you can sort of skew things that way. I sort of came from the speech, world, and so that's kind of, I did a lot more speeches and that sort of thing. If you come from more of an English, you're an English teacher that got stuck with professional communications by your principal, you can be a little bit more, focus on the grammar side and the writing, the professional writing. So it's very flexible and it can reflect your personality as a teacher. So this resource, Projects in Professional Communication, I feel like matches that need really well because it can be used in a number of different ways. So the first thing I want to, just say right up front is this is just a resource. It can be used however you want to use it. It could be if you're a new teacher, maybe you're, like I said, your principal said, just a couple of weeks ago, like, hey, you're going to be doing ProfCom, and you're like, oh gosh, what do I do? You could go from, chapter 1 all the way through the book, just step by step, and your kids will have a great year. They're going to, you're going to cover all the teaks. You're going to have a lot of fun. Or if you're a more experienced professional communication teacher, or just, want to get creative, you can kind of do your own thing and just pull it in as a resource. There is a natural flow to the book, but you can skip chapters. You can bounce around a little bit. You can stop and say, you know what, I'm going to drop that chapter. I've already got a project that I have developed that I like better than that. That's totally fine. And anything will really work. That's what's fun about the class is you can do a lot of different things. So feel free to use this as a, kind of a flexible solution as a full curriculum, or just a resource. Or if you want to, just use it as a reference. The writing in the book is phenomenal, and it's really well suited for the ninth grade sort of reading ability. It's actually at the lower end of the ninth grade scale. So if you have all these cool projects that you've developed over the years and get excited about, feel free to just use it as more of a text resource. All the information is in there. The philosophy of the book is that this is really a project-based curriculum. As you go through the readings and the chapters, there's going to be little mini projects dropped in there that build on each other in each chapter towards a final project. So each chapter has one project with little mini projects that build up to the one project at the end of the chapter. So again, you can go straight through and it all builds and sort of makes sense together, and it all leads towards this project. But or you can just kind of drop those mini projects out and do the big project, or it works all these different ways. Really, the main philosophy of this program is that we want students interacting and communicating with each other in many different ways. So with partners, with small groups, presentations in front of the class, more formal presentations, or just class discussions. What you and I know as professional, adults is that communication with other adults, it can be tricky, but it's a really important part of advancing your career, getting along with your coworkers, and actually having productive work. And so that's what we really want. So anytime that kids are communicating and interacting, even though it's a little bit messier than just sort of a lecture, take notes, read, take tests, that's not really the purpose of this class. And we really want students to come out of the class understanding a little bit of the process of communicating with other students. So a lot of the projects, it'll be a lot of students interacting with each other, and you may just kind of be monitoring, and that's great. That's really the purpose. And that's really the philosophy of the book. We want the students getting practice at these things because it's not natural. Sometimes communication is hard, it's difficult, it's tricky. The real objective here is to equip these students to be college and career ready and be ready to enter the workforce. And that's the main thing that employers say younger professionals are lacking is communication skills. So be it emails or formal letters and documents, or just having a rough conversation with a coworker. It's tricky, and we want to just get practice doing professional communication. So anyway, let's dive in. For the purposes of this PD, I'm assuming that you have at least the teacher wraparound and the teacher resource binder. It'd be helpful to have the student book, but the student book pages are actually 1-for-1 in the teacher resource. I believe they're slightly smaller, so I like to have the student book with me, but if I call out a page number, it will be the same in the student book and the teacher wraparound. Okay, so let's get an idea for how the book is structured. If you'll look at Roman numeral page 5, you will see sort of the contents in brief. There are 6 units and 21 chapters. Each chapter is going to deal with a different aspect of professional communication, and it's going to have, like I said earlier, 1 project per chapter. Now, if you want to kind of dive in and see a little bit more, turn the page to Roman numeral 6, and you will be able to see sort of the essential question that each chapter is dealing with, and a few of the aspects in each of the chapters. Now, if you'd like to see a little bit more about the chapter projects, let's go to Roman numeral page 18. That's XVIII. And we're going to see a little bit of like the name of the project for each of the 21 chapters and what it's dealing with. Now, if you're like me, you want to know a little bit more detail about what are the students actually going to be doing. If I'm deciding whether to use this project or something similar that I might have created in the past, I've created this document that really pulls out in one sentence, here's what the students are really doing. For instance, let's take chapter 3, right? It's called The Communication Industry Today. The project is called Predicting the Trends. Well, that could be a lot of different stuff. So what are they really going to be doing? Students work in small groups to chart economic trends of their chosen pathway. That's something they did in the previous chapter, and predict where they might lead. So that's just the project for chapter 3, and you get the idea as a teacher when you're planning out your year, if you want to actually do that project or not. So I would be happy to email this document to you. I think it's kind of handy. So feel free to email me at zsmith@perfectionlearning.com. Z as in zebra, zsmith@perfectionlearning.com, and just ask for the professional communication chapter projects document, and I'll be happy to send that over to you. Okay, so let's dive into the structure of a chapter. Every chapter is structured the same way, so once you kind of see the pieces and the parts of one chapter, you'll pretty much know how the other ones play out. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be looking at chapter 14. So if you'll turn in your books to page 292, this chapter's at the end of a unit, and there's a little bit of material that opens each unit, and I'll show you that in a little bit, but I want to go to the chapter real quick. So 292, chapter 14. The title of this chapter is Group Discussions. I feel like business communication a lot of the times comes down to interacting with other people in small groups, and whether that is productive or not productive, can really be determined by what the individual members are bringing to the group and how they interact in the group. So group discussions, the essential question is listed out here very plainly on page 292. So if you have to list your objectives or your essential questions for your lesson plans, we wanted to really make that explicit here. What are the elements of effective group communication? So not only are we going to read about it, we're going to be practicing it as well. And that's what's nice about, you're going to see in these chapters, all the content, we are going to ask students to read some. I mean, that's very important. But we're going to be practicing the things that we're reading about pretty much directly after we read about them. So we're going to learn a concept, and then we're going to practice. And those little bits of practice are going to build up into the final project. So here we go. The essential question is, what are the elements of effective group communication? And the title of the chapter project is Got a Problem? Here's the Solution. Look at that second paragraph. Here's a little trick. If you want to know where I pulled the chapter project descriptions from, it's always in the second paragraph. It's like the first sentence of the second paragraph. So you see it says, for this project, you will work with a group to address a problem and try to solve it. So that's really where you can, just a quick way to find what was the basic gist of the project. That's a quick way to find it. Okay. So really, and as you go through this, you're going to see that the kids are going to identify a real world problem and then work within a group to propose solutions, and their final project is going to be presenting their solution to the group. Okay, what is CAPS? You see down there at the bottom, concept, audience, purpose, situation. It's important to identify in any communication setting if we want it to be appropriate, what is the concept? What are we trying to get across here? Right this time, it's the idea we're trying to get across is discussion leads to the accomplishment of group goals and purpose. That's really kind of the concept of this chapter. Who's the audience that this project will eventually be presented in front of? Classmates and teacher. What is the purpose? The purpose is to take part in a group discussion that offers solutions to a problem. And what is the situation? Collaborative classroom presentation. That's the situation. So you can apply CAPS to almost any sort of communication. Let's say it's a campaign speech for a political candidate. The concept might be their tax plan. Let's say the audience would be whoever's had come to that rally or that debate. What was the purpose? Well, to get elected. And what's the situation? They're in a political debate or they're at a political rally. So you can apply this to almost any sort of communication, and we're always going to do that at the beginning of our chapters. Just identify the CAPS, and this is basically just the environment in which this communication takes place. Next, on page 293, you'll see the key vocabulary. Some of the best practices for introducing vocabulary. You can have them write out the definitions. That's kind of old school, but they will make more sense in context when they read about them. But I do like to introduce them at the beginning of the chapter just to kind of get them in front of the kids and get their brains thinking in that direction. But we will address all that vocabulary within the chapter. And at the bottom of 293 is a little sort of warm-up activity for a chapter. We're not really into the content yet, but it's sort of like that anticipatory set, right? We're going to have a little project and a little discussion and we just call it Speak Up, okay? So this time the Speak Up activity is think about a group discussion you recently participated in. Quickly write a list of words that describe that experience. So we're going to think about a group discussion. We're going to write down just sort of some descriptors about that, and then we're going to share them out with the class. Real easy, real quick, and really that's just drawing upon students' prior knowledge. So we want to connect these concepts to the things that the students are already dealing with in their own life. If you can connect it to their life, the content will stick in their brains a lot easier. Okay, flip the page to 294, and you will see background for the project. So the chapter is really divided up into a few different major parts. You've got the intro, which we just looked at, background for the project. This is sort of like just the textbook info. And again, we're going to lace the project prep throughout. So it's not just going to be them reading about it. They're actually going to be participating and communicating. So background for the project is sort of I would say the heart and soul, kind of the main part of the chapter. And then we're going to look at the chapter project. Then there's, the end of chapter materials that we'll get to. But the main parts of the chapter will be background for the project. That's sort of like the information laced with the project prep, and then the project itself. Okay, so in this chapter, we are going to look at first how to plan for a group discussion. And I'm not going to go through all this content. You feel free to read this for yourself. I think the first time you go through this curriculum, by the way, if you just read through the project, or read through the chapter and then go to the teacher guide and sort of see all the teaching notes and the teacher wraparound, it might take a little while to get through that first, semester, that first go around through the book. But then you're going to feel a lot. If you annotate and you highlight, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable, and it's going to be a very quick lesson plan for you. So the first part of group discussion is going to be planning for that discussion, okay? So you see that purple and yellow box up at the top right of 294. This is just kind of a little call out of here are some strategies and best practices when you're participating in an informative discussion. So it's things like, come to the discussion well prepared, listen carefully, ask questions. Keep in mind that everybody needs the opportunity to speak. So just really, good constructive things to put in the kids' heads before they start with the next part here, project prep. Okay, so let's read this one. You see on 294, project prep, you're going to see these little purple and red boxes throughout. These are those little mini activities that the student will be doing as they go through the chapter. Okay, this one says with your project group. Okay, so we've already divided them into groups. Some of these will be, some of the project preps will be on your own or with a partner or with a group of 4. Typically, that's the structure of these things and how we're going to divide the students. So already we know it's going to be a group of 4, 3 or 4. With your project group, decide on the topic for an informative discussion. Agree on how to divide up the preparation for the discussion, and agree on a time to meet again. Participate in the informative discussion following the guidelines above. So we've read through these guidelines, and basically the students are going to identify a topic that they will identify a problem later on, and then propose solutions. So that means basically we're talking a political issue, a social issue, an environmental issue, a relationship issue. What is the topic that you want to take a look at? So once they do that, they will continue on reading, and you can kind of decide, depending on how long your class periods are, depending on if you're pulling in other projects, how much reading you want your students to do. But the yellow box, let's go to 295 now. The yellow box that says key point. So these are really things, we wanted to put these in there because they really drive home, this is what we're trying to get you to understand in this chapter, right? This key point is identify the purpose of group discussions and the processes professional groups use to solve problems and work towards common goals. That's what we're trying to do here, right? Now, the problem-solving process, you see the purple and yellow box down at the bottom. There's going to be a lot of sort of graphic organizers and some really stepped-out things to help the students in the problem-solving process. So that's another one of those. And I do want to point out that in this reading, we really wanted to make it accessible to ninth graders. Sometimes this is even taught at the middle school level at 7th and 8th grade. So the Lexile level of this, I believe it's right at the bottom of ninth grade reading level. And another thing that we wanted to do is to make it 2-column. If you think about newspapers, old school newspapers, you've got the 4 columns there. That's because it's easier to read. It's hard once you get to the end of a line, it's easier to jump to the left-hand side again when the columns are shorter, or thinner, I should say. The wider you get, the harder it is to jump all the way back to the left-hand side. And so you can actually read 2-column books like this faster than you can sort of more of a college-level text that goes all the way across the side of the page. So I would not be afraid to ask your students to either read this, on their own or at night if you want to do a flipped classroom type model. This is a very readable book, and students do, a big part of professional communication is reading. So as much as they don't like it, we try to give them, it is important, and we try to give them every tool to be able to access this text. Okay, so let's turn over to 296. The next topic here is framing discussion questions. Okay, we want to use precise language, focus on the problem, not the solution, and be open to objective discussion. So that's just more content. Types of discussion questions is our next topic here. And notice we've got another project prep. So before we identified the topic, and this time that we wanted to come up with a problem and eventually a solution for, this project prep is with your project group. So same group, identify a somewhat controversial issue to discuss, such as a problem with college student debt. List questions of fact, value, and policy that you could use in the discussion. So again, we're getting more specific about what issues we want to be addressing. And below there, you see the box fact, value, or policy. What are these different types of questions? You can use that box to sort of familiarize yourself with those different types of questions. Okay. Next page, we're looking at using critical thinking in groups. And again, it's just more content. There's a key point. Here's another project prep. Let's read this one, and then we'll kind of skip over the other ones and skip to the end. But with your project group, hold a discussion on another controversial subject, such as the death penalty. Allow enough time for substantial discussion. Employ critical thinking skills following the guidelines above. Okay, so how do we use critical thinking in group discussions? We've clearly pointed out some things that you can employ there in the purple and yellow box above. And the key point, again, here's a key point: employ critical thinking skills in groups to keep your conclusions sound. So it's not just about communicating; it's communicating and thinking at the same time that's going to lead to an effective group discussion. So as we go throughout the rest of the chapter, you'll see the same types of features, the text, the content, the project prep, the key points, and then the graphic organizers, the kind of purple and yellow boxes throughout. Okay, so let's go ahead and skip to page 309. And this is the second part of our chapter. The first part was background for the project. This section is called preparing for the project. And this is more of an activity-driven, group discussion type of thing. Whereas we were reading a lot of content before, this isn't content. These are, directions to interact in your groups. Make connections, focus, plan, develop. There's all very specific instructions within these for that project. And if you flip over to 310, again, last thing we're going to do before presenting the project is practice. And then here we go, we're going to present the project. Okay, so each group will present their project, and the last step is evaluating the project. Now, if you're like me and you don't like writing rubrics, I have good news. We have them all done and professionally written rubrics that are very easy to use and work very well. You can just sort of have the students look at these things and evaluate in their own heads, or you can look in the teacher resource binder and run copies of this rubric, and we'll point that out later where that will be located, but you can actually have the students evaluate their peers using this rubric. So we have learned the background for the project. We've kind of done the project prep, those little mini projects along the way. We have prepared the project, presented the project, and now we're going to evaluate the project. And then that's pretty much the end of the chapter, okay? For all intents and purposes, that's the structure of the chapter. There's a couple of features after that. There's 2 more features to be exact. So on page 312, you'll see, is this job for me? Each chapter is going to focus on one career or job, just to kind of familiarize the students with some of the careers that are out there, because you don't know what you don't know. And if we don't expose students to some of the potential career fields that are out there, they might, miss something that they might really enjoy and be able to be successful in. The last feature of each chapter is page 314. This is the chapter 14 review. So this is just sort of the content really in brief, and they can sort of review this and reflect back on the ideas that they've learned and put into practice in their project. Now, after the last chapter, 21, there are a few additional resources that you might find helpful. On page 516, there's a glossary with all the vocab words. And then starting on page 524, there are some additional resources. Page 525 would be the parliamentary procedure, if you so choose to teach your students parliamentary procedure, which is very helpful. That would be on 525. And then on 534, we have a writer's glossary of usage. So if you want your students to do a little bit more technical writing, that could be of use. Now, if you find that your students are having trouble with, grammar, punctuation, usage mechanics, that sort of thing, starting on page 550, there is what we call our language quick guide. And this is really just a reference tool that if you find that they're having trouble with adverbs or punctuation or, subject-verb agreement, that sort of thing, you can use this as intervention tools and assign them, on an as-need basis for individual students or as a class. Okay, so now let's look at the Teacher Wraparound Edition. If you'll grab your TWE, as we call it, the TWE, Teacher Wraparound Edition, and turn to page 292. That will put us right at the beginning of chapter 14. Notice that the page numbers for the student and the teacher edition are the same. And basically, this is a very straightforward, easy-to-use teacher resource. It gives you a lot of suggestions that you can use to teach each part of the chapter. None of them are mandatory, but it just sort of can facilitate either a better discussion of that point in the classroom or some suggestions as to how to make things kind of flow a little bit better. I do want to point out a few features. The best thing to do is just kind of explore, look through this, see how the things around the student book match up with the student book. But I'll just point out, no reason for me to read all these to you, but I do want to point out a few so you see kind of how it works. The very first thing on page 292, it says group discussions. This is the name of the chapter. There's a section at the top left to introduce just group discussions. And it says group discussions are an indispensable part of a group's functioning. Planning for them involves identifying the purpose of the discussion, asking questions, and providing effective leadership. Participants and leaders have responsibility to foster a supportive climate and work towards the group's goals. So again, you can kind of have a discussion in the classroom about that, read that out loud, and then move on to the essential question. And so the essential question in this chapter, like we said earlier, is what are the elements of effective group discussions? And then invite the students, if you look in the teacher wraparound material, it says invite the students to share with the class the best classroom discussion they've ever been a part of. Encourage them to describe the mood of the discussion, the challenges it offered, and the reasons why it was engaging. So again, we're hitting upon prior knowledge, prior experiences, and kind of setting up the discussion, sort of eliciting that their prior experiences to better set up the material that we're about to deliver. Okay, the chapter project is called Got a Problem. Here's the solution, of course. And whereas in the student edition, it just says, okay, let's identify some problems that are out there in the world that we could potentially address in this project. Well, in the teacher edition, it gives you the suggestion of drawing 3 columns on the board. One is for global and national problems, one is for kind of local and school-wide problems, and then one is more of a personal problem. And so as you elicit these responses from the student to identify problems, you put them in the appropriate category. There's some suggestions involving the CAPS and how to introduce that to the kids. And then one thing I find very handy is the objectives down at the bottom left-hand side of 292. The objectives, when I was in the classroom, we had to submit weekly lesson plans to our principal, and it always had to have the objective, right? And I was constantly having to think how to word things properly. Well, we give you the objectives right here. So if you need to put, it looks like there's 4 of them, and this is suggested for a week. So there you got, at least 4 of your days sorted out. Maybe you could use 1 for 2 days, and you've got your objectives already ready to go. So as you can see, each part of the student text has an analog in the teacher wraparound edition. So once you kind of read through the student pages, you can get some suggestions as to, some best practice suggestions as to how to teach that in the teacher wraparound. So notice on the right-hand side, we have the key vocabulary with all the definitions and some suggestions as to how to set up the speak up activity that we are starting our chapter with. Now, I would say the most important part of the teacher wraparound edition will be in the bottom section in the purple. So starting out the chapter, we have a pacing guide. If you flip back to 258, you'll see that this should only take like a week. There's a pacing guide on that page. This chapter is going to take roughly a week to get through. The teacher resource binder pages, any useful resource in the teacher resource binder, activity sheets, critique sheets, worksheet, test, all that sort of thing, you're going to see that listed out usually on the first page of the chapter in that bottom section. From time to time, there will be a personal message. This is a quote from George Bernard Shaw that I think is quite funny. Feel free to read that. And then there's a critical thinking piece here. It says, listen with the students to several minutes of a talk radio show, and then, ask them to state the show's agenda and identify the intended audience. So we're going to interpret, then analyze and evaluate, and then apply. So you can really take the students from just a surface level interpretation of what they're hearing all the way to applying their critical thinking and encouraging the students to call into that show and contribute to the discussion. So if you flip to page 294 now, you see the background for the project. Remember, this is the part where the students are doing reading and mini exercises and sort of building their project as they go. Each section has a teacher wraparound teaching suggestion. We'll just look at one of these. So planning for group discussion. Ask the students what they would do or have done to plan for a discussion with their parents about topics such as driving privileges or curfews. Again, trying to really connect it to their life. They had this discussion. What did they do to kind of get their ducks in a row before trying to get their parents to let them stay out late? So every section of the reading is going to have teaching suggestions and the teacher wraparound, and also the purple and yellow graphic organizers. We call them graphic interplays. Those are going to have discussion strategies that specifically relate to those boxes. Let's look to the kind of bottom left here. It says graphic interplay, strategies for participating in informed discussions. Challenge students to develop sample statements, comments, and questions that illustrate the strategies in the chart. So again, very straightforward, very easy to use. And also notice that the project prep items have teaching suggestions as well. That's going to be very important as the students build their projects together. So making sure that they are actually achieving what you want them to in the project prep items will be pretty important. Now on the bottom of page 294 in the purple section, you will see differentiated instruction suggestions. And we try to do as many of them as we could in case that you have a student with an IEP or that is struggling in some way. Any type of learning difference, we tried to put some suggestions in here to make sure that those students are able to access the content. So this particular page, we're looking at ADHD, struggling learners, accelerated learners, and visual learners. Let's go ahead and flip over to The next page, 296, more of these differentiated instruction suggestions. Students with OCD, struggling learners again, accelerated learners, verbal learners. So again, I think those things are really important, especially when you're doing your lesson plans and sort of the paperwork that goes with an IEP, which is, doesn't take a small amount of time. These can be helpful and some time-saving tools for you. Okay, moving along to page 309. There are just more, teaching suggestions as how to get your students to prepare properly for that project. Page 310, how are we actually going to present these projects and evaluate them? And remember that all your evaluation rubrics are going to be in the teacher resource binder. The very first page of the chapter has that teacher resource binder page. So in this case, it's going to be handout J, and that's what you would copy and pass out to your students. So if you would get out your teacher resource binder now, I'd like to point out some features of the TRB, as we call it, that I feel like could be particularly helpful. I know when I was in the classroom, I wrote all my own tests and worksheets and rubrics, and it just took an enormous amount of time. So when I saw the teacher resource binder, I got very excited. It would have saved me a lot of time to have a resource like this in the classroom. There's a lot of practical things that are really going to be of use. So if you look at the table of contents, you will see the first section is the teacher pages, and this is really just a lot of resources for you to read through, get some suggestions on things like, technology and late presentations and customizing assignments and that sort of thing. The ones that I feel like are most important are the first one there, the course objectives in your lesson planning, the scheduling options and the pacing guide. Because this is a semester-long course, we want to make sure that we're getting everything in a timely fashion. So there's a suggested pacing guide. And then dealing with communication apprehension. This is some really good suggestions as to what do you do with the students that, get a little bit nervous getting up in front of people. It is very frightening sometimes to get up in front of your peers and present, but this is some suggestions as to how to help with that. And then there's the ExamView assessment suite. If you haven't used that, these are some very quick, easy instructions as to how to generate your assessments and your tests. So it's very brief, really easy to use. So the next section here is the communications information pack. So these are going to be some resources, some handouts that you can copy and give to the students. There's a student contract, letter to parents or caregivers, the inventory of personal activities and personal qualities, overcoming communication apprehension. There's a little activity that you can do that. Basic communications terminology, characteristics of effective interpersonal communication, evaluating group roles, and delivering and evaluating presentations. So these can be used in a few different parts of the book. The career handouts are next, and then we're going to move on to the more chapter-specific resources. There are activity sheets, worksheets, critique sheets, test, unit test, chapter test, all that sort of thing. So anything that you need to possibly run off and give, run copies off and give to the students will be in your teacher resource binder. And so that's just a brief overview of the teacher resource binder. I would invite you to flip through it. There's a lot of good stuff in here in those teacher pages and the communications information package. I would encourage you not to just skip straight to the unit specific resources, but look at those. There's some really good stuff in there. And in the back of the TRB, the very last section is just the answer key to all the chapter tests and unit tests. That's where you're going to find the answers for those items. Okay, a few more resources that we are providing to help you in your teaching of professional communications would be the PowerPoint presentations. And these are chapter-specific PowerPoints that are going to they're visual aids basically to assist you in any class discussion, lecture type things, and also with the chapter projects. So kind of step-by-step walking you through the chapters, and those will be accessed through the digital teacher materials. Another resource that we are providing is what we're calling the companion website. It can be located at communications.perfectionlearning.com. Basically what we did is we realized that there's a lot of good stuff out there for professional communications, and so we just scoured the internet, found a lot of cool tools, and correlated them to our chapters. So if you need additional activities, extensions, or further research, especially in the skills inventory and the career research chapters, really good stuff on the companion website. Don't neglect to check that out and see what each chapter has to offer. So like I mentioned at the top of the video here, professional communications is a great class because it's very flexible and you as the teacher have a lot of latitude as to how you teach the class. Whereas I was more presentations and projects, some of you might want to go a little bit deeper on the more technical aspects of writing, professional writing. So to help bolster that side of our offering, we're including a free resource through the digital materials called The Essential Guide to Language, Writing, and Literature. There are several chapters that you could find useful here, but particularly chapters 24 through 27. Chapter 24 is Communication for College. 25 is Communication for the World of Work. 26 is Communication for the Digital Age. And chapter 27 is Speeches and Presentations. So we wanted to equip you with just some more tools, some more lessons if you feel like your students need a little bit of extra work in these areas. So that's pretty much it. I want to thank you again for adopting Perfection Learning's projects in professional communications. Please don't hesitate to reach out if we can help you with anything, and we wish you and your students well as you go into the school year.